It's fair to say Matt Ward is one of the most controversial writers in Games Workshop's history. He was responsible for the end times, the destruction of the old world, or at least he wrote a lot of it. He also did codexes like the Necron and the Space Marine Codex, which were basically hated by some fans of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. He also did War of the Ring in the Lord of the Rings strategy battle game. Again, one of the more controversial things that brought massive battle games to what had previously been a skirmish game built around characters. He very rarely does interviews about his time at Games Workshop, only really talking about his career as an author, sci-fi fantasy author, since leaving Games Workshop. But I managed to convince him to sit down with me and talk through everything, from the controversies in 40k and fantasy to a lot of Lord of the Rings based chatter. But I wanted to start by asking him a little bit about his origins. Where did it all begin, and how did he get into a job writing for Games Workshop?
It's always the same things, really. It always feels a little bit dull because they belong to so many other people as well. It is Lord of the Rings and it is Doctor Who. That's where I come into things, and Star Wars as well, I suppose, if we want to go across the Atlantic.
What was it about those things that caught your imagination as a young person?
I like the worlds that they create. I think just the endless creativity that's on display, particularly in something like Doctor Who, where you go to a new setting every 3 to 4 weeks and there's a completely different set of things going on, and whereas with something like Star Wars it's much more to do with that consistent world. I suppose it's the opposite. I've never thought about it that before. It's almost the opposite. It's that consistent world vision. Certainly there are 3 films, it all feels like a continuous, it's a world you can live in, and I think maybe that's the thing that underpins it, is that Star Wars and sort of Tolkien's Middle-earth are both settings where you feel like you can walk into them, whether they're on the screen or on the page. They feel like real places. Mm. And then I ended up with a copy of Hero Quest one Christmas. And then it steadily starts to snowball from there, because of course you have all the White Dwarf tie-ins. You go, oh look, now you can go and put Skaven into your Hero Quest, and we've done the Advanced Hero Quest one as well, and steadily lure you in. You know, the first hit is free. It's that, isn't it?
And obviously most of us who are watching this, I'd imagine, have played either that or some of the early games, but not everyone gets to go and work at Games Workshop. Was it always an ambition, and how did it happen?
I don't know that you say it was always an ambition. I don't know that I particularly had ambitions of what I was going to do as I was growing up. But it's the world's most boring story of how I actually worked there, is because they were hiring and I applied. And it really is, you know, everyone wants to, oh no, look, it was the lifelong dream, or it's this wonderful crux of circumstance and fate. And you say, no, they were hiring and I applied and they hired me. It turned out there were 2 jobs going in the end, because they wanted someone for Lord of the Rings, and that's the one that I ended up doing, which, as I hadn't looked at or touched the game system, and then to go into an interview and go, oh yeah, go away and write some scenarios for this.
Oh, wow. Is that what they asked to do in the job interview then?
Yeah.
There must have been good ones if you'd never played it before. And you managed to
I honestly don't know, but I'm quite good at picking up on formats for things, which is part of, it's a piece of advice for anyone who's ever going into any kind of writing job. Pay attention to the format people want things in, because rightly or wrongly for a lot of people, that is the first place where they go, well, we're not going to have trouble with this person because they clearly can't follow instructions. And you know, you can get, it's not a hard and fast rule, no rules are hard and fast, but the number of times I've seen that come up. And the other thing is I generated so much stuff in the time that I had to do it as well, that I think that patched over anything. But it was because it was things like, go away and write a scenario from the Two Towers, because the Two Towers wasn't out, of course, at that point, so we didn't know. You know, they must have known. They'd been working on it for a while, but in the wider world, we didn't know what was going to be in there. So I thought, oh, we'll do the ambush in Ithilien. But looking through the book I'd been given, because again, pre-Two Towers book, said, well, there are no Rangers of Ithilien, there are no Haradrim, this and the other, so I ended up not just writing the scenario, but writing profiles for all of the things that I thought were missing that we needed to go in there.
Writing profiles and also doing the scenario sounds like a great way of doing it. I mean, and it must have helped that you already said Lord of the Rings was something that you loved growing up. I mean, what was it like then going into a team going, wow, I'm able to write stuff based on one of my favourite books ever?
It's weird. I mean, it doesn't stop being weird, I think, I think that's one of the things, if you're a writer, you hit these thresholds of things being weird. Going to work for Games Workshop is weird. Going to work on content that's directly tied into the brand new movies that have never really been done before, so that obviously you then start to become aware of a load of that's what's going to go on before that point, because you have to do the job. That's also weird. But then as it moves forward and to where I am now, oh look, I am a published novelist with Orbit. That's weird. I've written words and now actors are saying them in this computer game.
Vermin died.
A trap! That's weird, because I grew up with computer games when they were much more straightforward. Like Space Invaders level of much more straightforward.
Yeah, Vermintide's a lot more complicated.
It's a lot more complicated than that. And then going through to, I know these actors because I've seen them in things on the television that in some cases were on when I was growing up. That's weird. That's really, really weird. And you have to sort of, it becomes normal over time, but in the moment it is still weird.
Can you remember the first time you saw words that you'd written, a scenario, a bit of fluff or whatever it was, published in a Games Workshop book? It must have been the Lord of the Rings stuff.
I think the first thing that would have gone to print would likely have been the Two Towers battle report, which of course is a very different fish anyway, because it's not really a creative thing. You are recording what's gone on there beat by beat, and I think that. I think we did that like the week after I started there. The first thing in the book would have actually been Shadow and Flame. Shadow and Flame. Yeah. The first of the not wholly movie based things, which is absolutely where my brain is, to be honest. Stuff like this, I love the bits and pieces that are in the cracks. So my particular favourites being the Barrow. I think the Barrowites might have been the first bit of rules writing I did for Lord of the Rings, or for Games Workshop generally, which is why the paralysed rule is probably more complicated than it needs to be, because that's the first thing that you do. They are my strongest memory from when I read the book, because I read the book when I was about 7. Not necessarily like the horror of the actual moment, but the build up to it was definitely something that spooked me very, very badly, and I had to put it down and then come back to it a lot later. It's probably the kind of thing that kept me up at nights. But they definitely stayed with me to the point that that's why years later it was like, no, can we do something with Arno? Can we do something with Arno? The Arno stuff's great. We can have all kinds of fun, spooky stuff in Arno. And it's probably why, sort of almost like broadly speaking, the undead thing runs through not only what I used to collect when I was collecting miniatures, but also what I write about now. My wife said, do we need to put you in therapy, because there's always a lot of undead things in everything that you write, and it always gets a little bit macabre, and maybe that's true, I don't know.
This is a slight diversion, but did you ever think that the Lord of the Rings rule set was particularly better or worse than the 40k fantasy as it developed?
I think it's newer. I think it's really what it comes down, because ultimately it is best part of 20 years more recent, and I think rules writing, like anything else, evolves over time. It's particularly obvious now because obviously companies make it part of the selling point of a new product, and they go, look, we've done this is the thing. It's almost like the Call of Duty effect, and you go, this Call of Duty is like the one that you had before, but now these 3 things. And you can see that with anything. I think the nature of its size, particularly at the start, meant that it was a lot tighter, and I think I have to assume that was one of Rick's original goals when he was doing it, to make something a little...
Scenarios, wasn't it? It was all about skirmishes with 9 heroes rather than massive fantasy battles originally.
And it's the thing I always said, actually, when I started working there, is it feels a lot more chess-like than a lot of grander battle systems, be they Warhammer or anything else, because, yes, you still have the randomness of the dice in there, but mechanically it's capped a lot closer. It's not as sprawling. You don't have that thing of going, well, I must memorise all these 3 million things that can be done on my side of the board and on the opponent's side of the board, and obviously that spreads over time because that's just what happens with game systems, but certainly at the time it was a lot more compact, to the point that special rules were used incredibly infrequently. And ultimately it's serving a different goal. There is something glorious about, Seri Drank's Warhammer miniatures on a table, particularly when they're painted by someone who can actually paint, not like me. But equally, if the scenario is set up right, if the miniatures are on point, and of course, with very, very few exceptions, the Lord of the Rings miniature range has never been anything other than stellar. And particularly the design and construction of the boards, that makes it that immersive experience. You feel like you can step into that world.
Pelennor Fields and then later on the sort of Shadow in the East and all those sorts of books, they were kind of building, you mentioned filling in the cracks. This was some of these things were literally expanding on, potentially only a few sentences or a page or something that Tolkien had written. What was it like? I mean, did you sort of realise or grasp the enormity of this, of going, well, this is my favourite book when I was growing up, and now I'm going to add my bit to the lore of Harad, for example. I mean, what was that like?
I mean, again, I use the word weird again. Yeah, I should have a thesaurus on hand for moments like this, but there's definitely a sense of responsibility, because you don't know how things are going to last over time, because obviously the way some licenses work is, and I've worked on at least one like this, where they will go, oh, do people like it? Right, it's canon now, tick, and then it's there forever and ever and ever, whether you are necessarily proud of it or not, I guess. And for other ones, it's no, this will never be canon, this will never be here, but then in the minds of a particular generation of player base, you want it to live up to what they're expecting, and yeah, so there's definitely a sense of responsibility there, particularly with something like Harad, as you say, where there's more written about it than you might expect, but it doesn't tend to show up in paragraphs. You'll go, no, this is a sentence, this is the sentence, and you can start assembling it from the rest of that. But you do want to be careful, just because obviously times change, tastes change. It was really important, actually, even then at the time, to go, these are not just bad guys, these are a civilization unto themselves, and they're not necessarily there. I think the anchor point for all of it was Faramir's wonderful speech.
What lies or threats led him on this long march from home?
That became the core of what particularly I was trying to do with the Haradrim, because the movies are great, but the bad guys tend to be quite, and this is true of the books as well, to be fair, they're wall-off, faceless things to stab the good guys for the most part, and sometimes they wear different clothes.
Yeah, that's true.
Because I think the more I think about it in hindsight, I think the point Tolkien is making is, it's almost that point about when people talk about like zombie movies and zombie shows, isn't it? It's not the things that look like the literal threat, it's the things that arise from within, from the dynamics of the group. So Sauron is a big faceless evil, for better or worse. The Orc Horde is a big faceless evil. The Nazgul are always there as existential terror and dread, but they're not really personalities. The Witch King gets a little bit right before he takes a bow and leaves Middle-earth forever. But the actual pressure arises from people like Bertha Sackville Baggins, Ted Sandyman, Bill Ferny, Saruman, Grima Wormtongue, and Denethor, Boromir, the people who who are the ones that are falling to the pressure of the times that they're in, and are either just selfish little whatsits to start with and you can't help them, or what are truly noble intentions then get twisted through a lens and become something very, very different. I mean, thankfully we've outgrown all of that in the real world. That never happens anymore. But being able to go, no, the Haradrim are not just orcs without the makeup, and go, no, there is a whole world, there's a whole civilization, because part of the companion pieces that I did for White Dwarf at the time was getting into some of the regions in Harad and, you know, trying to help people create that inspiration of, what if I don't want to paint them red and black? What are the things at play? How can I fall in love with these in a different way? Which of course then fed through all the way through, so it's in the second Harad book. Little bits and pieces of it actually turned into miniatures by the time we hit that Harad book, and then again by the time we hit War of the Ring. So things like the Merchant Guard of Abrakan, the Hasharin, the first Hasharin is in that book, but they definitely refine and become something slightly different the further we go through. And yeah, none of those things are technically on the page, but I think most of them live in that space. They live in that. They are credible parts of that world, and that's the thing that you're aiming for. And I think I certainly have one friend who grew up with War of the Ring, who some of those things are just inseparable from the source material in his mind, because that's what he's grown up with, and think that's great. It's really, because that's the goal. You're not trying to replace things, because you can't replace things, but you want to, it wants to be convincing enough, if that makes sense.
I chime very well with your friend there, because I tried as a kid to read the Silmarillion and just...
Silmarillion's a hard read.
And even the appendices, I mean, I could read, and I did read some of them, but not a lot of them. But I was instead devouring these source books that you and others had written, because they filled in the gaps in the story, because I wanted more Lord of the Rings. I got 3 films, and I got the special features, but I wanted more. I always had a very positive reaction, but I don't know whether, did you ever come across anyone who was like, this is outrageous, why would you, who are you to change Tolkien's world or add to it?
I don't think it's specifically in changing Tolkien's world, because most of the changes that we did in those situations had already been done by New Line Pictures or Peter Jackson or Warner Brothers or whoever you want to put in that the chain of grief. You know, we're not responsible for no Tom Bombadil and no Glorfindel and things like that.
But you did get to do them eventually.
But yes, no, absolutely. As we got into some of the marginal things, obviously people have their own opinions on what those things are. Obviously, some people get rubbed the wrong way when you go in a different direction, and that's fine as well, because it is that thing of, it only happens because they care. I think a lot of that, I mean, because, you know, again, we're talking like 15, 20 years ago now, and I'd be a lot more worried about it these days, because I think what people, somewhere along the line, a lot of that passion has become toxic, at least in the way that it manifests. It's the anonymity of social media accounts and things like that, because you see it with almost any big property these days. But at the time, I'm not saying everyone was polite when it came up, but you understand the point of passion that they're working from, and it does come from a love of the source material. But ultimately, sometimes the things you do for your job don't align precisely with the views of 1,000 completely different people who you've never met, and that's just how it works.
And I absolutely want to come back to that point, because I'm trying to work narratively through, but there's definitely some stuff about that controversies later I want to talk about. But before we finish on Lord of the Rings, there's two big books that I want to talk about. One of them I have here, the other one I don't have. The first one is Legions of Middle-earth, and this was like, I think this might have been the last thing you did before the War of the Ring, or around. It was certainly around the same time. But there's a lot of stuff in here that is referred to, and I could flick through the pages, but I've written it down. It's characters like Meneldor and Landrevel, the other great eagles, werewolves, black-hearted trees, Kaisamu, and stone giants, and there are others. But these are things that are mentioned here, which never got a model or a actual profile written. They were clearly part of the plan.
Yeah.
Can you remember anything about them? Because there'll be people playing right now so desperate to know what they were meant to be.
I mean, part of it was, it was obviously a very different era of Games Workshop, and part of it was laying out that sort of aspiration of what we wanted to do moving forward, and the nature of these things, because I work way more in video games than I do with miniatures these days, and it's as true there as it is here, is that what you want to do and what you have the resource to do are never the same thing. And I think so many of those things came reasonably close to getting made, but then other things happened and time moves on. I think it would have been wonderful to go back and fill some of those gaps in, but that's just what happens sometimes. Obviously some things, quite a lot of things that are in that one did actually finally manifest as miniatures, but there are, as you say, there are some very obvious particular gaps.
Did you when you wrote those words down, Landreval or the Black Hearted Tree, did you have an idea in your head when you wrote the word down, it might be something like this, or was it literally just you wrote those words down because you thought that would be good?
I would always have a profile written for things.
Can you remember any of it?
Goodness, no.
No, it's probably scrawled on some bit of paper hidden away.
I would literally have had a file that was full of all the things that, because you go, right, we could make this is what his profile would be, this is how it would fit in the game. But I couldn't tell you what it is. I would have written profiles for things like Alatar and Palander, which of course were never on the cards, they were never anywhere near what we could do with the game. But maybe we would be able to one day. Maybe we could have called them just the Blue Wizards, and in fact technically they're sort of kind of in War of the Ring. I have written so many profiles for things over the years that have not seen the light of day.
That's so annoying. I wanted you to say, oh yes, I remember the Black Hearted Tree was it was probably move 8 and it was strength 6 and it did this. But I mean I know that was an idealistic idea, but it's fascinating to see that there would have been something somewhere that maybe Games Workshop has a copy of in the cupboard somewhere. But and after Legions there was it might have been the same time. I can't quite work out the timelines because they're both the same year, but War of the Ring was a thing, and I kind of want to ask a bit about where the thought of the War of the Ring came from. Was this something that Games Workshop had gone and said, Apocalypse has done really well in 40k a couple of years before, big battles, big miniatures, we can sell a lot more miniatures, we want you to do that with Lord of the Rings, or was it different?
It will have been a thing that I was asked to do, certainly, because that's how it works, right? Yeah. It would have been about capturing, as you say, sort of those larger battle scenes. We were talking about it a little while ago about 2000 Return of the King, but being able to do those things at that scale would have been at the heart of it. Particularly as well, by that point, Lord of the Rings was more collectible than it had been at any point before. So much more of it was in plastic. We will have had plastic dwarves at that point. We had a fair few plastic elves. We had all the various races of men. There were so many different kinds of orcs in plastic at that point. It made getting up to that Warhammer scale, and it's not quite Warhammer scale even then, partly because of how those movement trays work, you don't get as many in the same space. It made it genuinely attainable for people because it's an expensive hobby. It's always been an expensive hobby since I was a kid, but certainly the improvement in technology and the mass production made it a lot more straightforward and a lot more affordable for people to get involved with.
In terms of the mechanics of War of the Ring, this was, because obviously it was based on some of the rules that Rick and Alessio had used already, but this was like a change in the sense that this is your first rule book that you kind of had a bit more of a blank slate, is that right?
Yeah, I think more or less. I mean, the thing I should say is that I did work very closely with Jeremy Vitok on it. Jeremy generally gets remembered for handling a lot of almost like the hobby sections and all of that. Look, now you can do some fantastic mad things with your miniatures, but no, actually he was absolutely part of the rules process in that. And he would never say that himself because he's very modest. But no, it's really important that I think whenever we talk about these things that we try and remember who worked on things, because obviously that part of the narrative gets lost along the way, particularly when names vanish from books entirely and everything that goes with that. So,
do you remember any of the things that you wanted to achieve with it, and whether you did?
One thing that I definitely wanted to make work, which we've kind of already touched on a little bit, Legions of Middle-earth, although not in words, is having that sense of not fairness necessarily, but making sure that there is something for everyone, and that you feel that your collection of toy soldiers is actually a valid collection that you can take and put on the table straight away. or that you can add to in a fairly organic way without you feeling like, well, I've been stupid for buying these things because now I'm just basically making my life harder when I want to play the game. So that's why, again, because that's the logic why things like the Black Archer-trees and so on exist in Legions of Middle-earth, and going, well, what are the things that we would fill out this army so it feels like it's actually got enough presence and enough grit to be able to do a thing? Because there's a completely different selection of things that never got made in War of the Ring. I talked about the little Council of Wizards earlier. I think there's a couple of other things like that where it's well, it'd be nice to do this, and this would be really good. But that's why you have things like Allies rules in there. It was an enabler for you to go, that's an awesome toy soldier, I want that. Reducing those restrictions. Obviously, it becomes a little bit difficult once you get into the Spirit competitive play, because how things interact and how the world goes mad around them makes that a little bit of an unpleasant experience sometimes.
That was kind of the last thing you did for Lord of the Rings, the Legions and War of the Ring, and then you went off into other parts of Games Workshop. And I'll be honest, I don't know much about the ins and outs of the fantasy and 40k. I remember playing it when I was younger, but I'm not very much in that world at the moment. I'm very much in Lord of the Rings, but I definitely remember some of the books and some of the criticism you got for some of the books. And I realise this is a potentially sensitive topic, but I mean, how bad did it get when you got some flack because your name was on an army book that people really hated?
Oh yeah, and I think probably more than one. The interesting thing, I think, for me, and you don't really necessarily realise it at the time, but you do years later, you go, oh, apparently I wrote that thing, or that was my idea. And you go, well, no, it wasn't. I don't know that it was the rules for the most part. I think there were some things there were some elements where both settings were going through some changes at the time and trying to bring focus on different things back to the fore, and those happened to be the books that I was working on. But I mean, the joy of it is you don't have to interact with it unless you are presented with it, and the truth is that most people are absolutely lovely, as we talked about before. Actually, people can get passionate about stuff, but that's where it stops. And I've never had sort of direct contact, I think, with anyone who's been as unhappy as you've been saying. I've had messages over the years, not for some time now.
What sort of things were people saying then?
Oh, the details. I can't even remember. This is the thing. It's because I don't try to carry it with me.
Well, you wouldn't. Who would want to remember the negative things people said? I'm just what I'm trying to get at is how horrible were people? Because it must be really hard to receive horrible I mean, it just generally is. I mean, I get people commenting on my videos sometimes saying you're a complete moron, but if it's on a scale where your name sometimes appears and people go, oh, he's an idiot, he ruined fantasy or whatever.
Oh, I think there are definitely two versions of me exist now. There's the one, and there's the version of me that is the one that actually worked on things and did maybe some of the things that they're talking about, almost never for the reasons that they talk about. And then there's the one that for a while just existed as this, I don't know how you describe it, but almost like this creation of what people wanted to be, because it makes for a better story. It makes for a better thing to get annoyed about. Because I still have, because I will honestly say I still have conversations to this day where someone will say, oh yeah, I saw all of this going around, and I actually got caught up in it, but now I realise that that was just ridiculous, and how untrue it is, and other bits and pieces.
How did all of that make you feel at the time?
I mean, it doesn't make you feel happy, but the truth is that you can't influence how people react to things that you do. You can only influence the things that you do. That's a horribly psychological jargon, but you can't stop people saying or doing terrible things. You can't stop them being wrong about things. And when I say being wrong about things, I don't mean subjective things about, well, is it better if we did it this way or this way? I mean, No, I literally did not write that book, guys. I don't know where you've got that one from, because that is a thing that absolutely has come up over the years. Certainly, at least one of the things I've seen floating around, it was, yes, because he did this and he ruined this, and you think, I had nothing to do with that book. It's just that thing that goes on. And again, it's not, when it comes right down to it, it's not about me, and it was never about me. It was about how they felt about things, and a lack of control they felt about something that was really important to them. And it's a hard thing to deal with, I think, at the best of times. I mean, I have had things that I have known and loved, and this has now changed beyond all recognition. It's not for me anymore. And that journey of getting to that point and going, doesn't mean any of this, it doesn't change how I feel about this bit that I loved. I can still love this. I can just decide that this bit isn't for me any longer. But I think it's said, isn't it, about your friends, is that as you're growing up, sort of your friends are the people you're closest to, and you think they're going to be with you all your life. And as the years pass, you realise that some of them you will fall out with, some of them you will just drift away from through no fault of your own, and your relationship to them will change. And sometimes that's a really hard thing, and I think the first couple of times that you register that becomes very, but it's also true of our passions and the things that we love, be it toy soldiers, be it movies, be it books, video games, whatever. How you want to dress, how you choose to decorate your home, all of these things are always in flux. And I think there's always a tendency to feel a sense of, there's a strange emotional baggage comes with that. And I don't say that to
no, I understand what you're getting at.
Yeah,
right? Because if you're passionate about, I don't know, the Necrons or Orcs, and they've been a thing that you've played and collected and painted for a decade or more, and then something changes, I can understand the sort of, because there's a lot. It's the same with, like you said, about the Star Wars films. The people fall in love with those first three, and then they go back to the prequels, and then something changes, or oh no, that's not what I expected or hoped or wanted, and it sort of ruins my imagination almost. Because you fill in the gaps, don't you? Everyone fills in the gaps themselves.
No, absolutely. I think it's really difficult to be confronted with something that is now, it almost feels like the truth that you have embraced is no longer there any longer, and it has been erased. But the truth is, how we interact with any kind of fictional property is entirely up to us. And I think, again, there are some people, there are always bad actors in these things who just are just angry because they are angry, or because the anger is the point. There are a lot of people who are passionate about things, and sometimes that cools over the years, and they look back and go, well, I don't know why I did that. Maybe some of them are still angry and frustrated now. I don't know.
Is it true that you got death threats?
No, I see that going around all the time. It's, as I say, it's that I see little bits and pieces like that, and go, where does this come from?
Yeah.
I see all kinds of other little bits of connected, even down to and that's why they took the names off the books, because
that's exactly what I was going to follow up with. Yeah,
absolutely not. But yeah, it takes on a life of its own, and it's when it comes down to it, you've been very good, we've danced around it, but what it really comes down to is, it comes down to the Space Marine Codex, and then for a much smaller subgroup of people, probably the Necron one that came after it, I think, and then the End Times, which is this whole other thing.
I think something to do with the Ultramarines being like, weren't they your favourite thing? And then people say you're an Ultramarines fanboy and you just wanted them to be the best, and all this sort of stuff.
So we were talking about Space Crusade earlier.
Yeah.
So Space Crusade, Ultramarines, Blood Angels, Imperial Fists.
Sure.
Mine were always the Imperial Fist. You can tell mine are the Imperial Fists because I've got 2 Imperial Fist books with my names on that. Well, I say with my names on, that it comes after that point, but I wrote 2 Imperial Fist supplements in the end because those were the chapter that I liked.
Right. So is it just not true that you were the Ultramarines fanboy and that's why you ruined Space Marines? That's what people say.
The Ultramarines are the template that all the other chapters push back on, and the fact that they push back on it is part of what makes them special. At least that's how it was explained to me and how I understood it, and still understand it now, even, to be honest. And I think the fear for a lot of people at the time is it was making other things less special. But again, it's really hard to, and I shouldn't speak for what people were thinking and feeling, because that's for them to say. But I mean, ultimately, it's really hard to put a book out for a company like Games Workshop without it having passed approval stages in these cases, like literally a dozen people. So I'm not saying that I haven't done whimsical things in books, of course I have, and I think most of them still haven't been caught, so that's fine, and I'm not going to talk about them here because that will spoil the surprise for people. But that's not my direction for what Ultramarine should be.
Yeah, I guess because, like you say, it's a company. It's not like you wrote it and then signed it off yourself and then sent it to the printers. There's got to be a lot of people involved, so that everyone. So you know, if you're the person getting the criticism, there should also be a number of other people who approved and probably said, this is the direction, this is what we'll agree to, this is the model we're going to have to design now and develop over the next year while you're writing the book.
Because that's how making anything works, right? And. But ultimately, when it comes down to it, it's when it really comes down to it, it's a subjective thing, and people set the direction of the intellectual property. Ultimately, every word that is written in any of these things over the years is there to enhance and support the toy soldiers that people love to collect, paint and play games with. Ultimately, that's what Games Workshop wanted to do with its property. Yeah. So that's what happens.
And you mentioned Necrons, so, and because you mentioned it, I want to ask a question about it, because that was a very tricky one, I think, to develop in a way that made sense, because Necrons are just the Terminator, right? Like the Terminator films turned into a miniature in the 1980s or whenever the first Necron did. But so you had the challenge, or someone had the challenge of saying, how do we expand this into an army that is kind of our thing? And people are a bit critical of it because they're overpowered or whatever, which I couldn't give a toss about. Fine, but
everything is overpowered all the time.
For a brief period, right? But
apart from Bretonnians, they generally never are. But
that's true. But the sort of concept, I guess, is that they then became a bit more like Tomb Kings or sort of, you know, Egyptian-inspired stuff, but in a sort of metal case, and people don't like that, or some people don't like that.
It's weird.
Like that. I thought it was a cool idea.
It's weird because the timings of it is that I don't think that was ever particularly the intention. The intention was to make them more into creatures with personalities of their own, so that you could then, as you can with almost everything else, then bring something of yourself into it and go, this is the character that I like, or this, I don't like any of those characters, but I've now been shown that I can make my OG character, which is the one that does this, and this is a hit. You know, he likes to collect spoons and eat cheese, but he doesn't eat cheese because he's a skeleton and it all falls out, or whatever. It doesn't matter. And that was the goal with it. It is that weird coincidence. I think the Tomb Kings book was being worked on roughly at the same time, but oddly with that, the Tomb Kings themselves weren't particularly fleshed out at that stage. I would almost look at it a different way, is that the Tomb Kings ended up becoming a lot closer to what the Necrons were already being in the process of re-becoming. That's a horrible language. But again, it's that thing of, I was very careful at the time to go, you know what, if you still want the mindless, faceless, we are just serving star gods and we want to eat the galaxy thing. No, some Necrons are absolutely still like that. But here are we're going to talk about all the other ones who aren't just like that anymore. So again, just trying to leave those doors open for people. I mean, and in fairness, I think it's I don't hear many complaints about Necrons now. I think it's just become that thing of, no, this is what they are. And they seem to have thrived quite nicely off the back of it.
I really like that Necron code, and that was the first 40k army I ever played was Necrons, and it was really cool to have something new and different, and some cool models and some cool extra lore to go with it. So yeah, I would never complain. So I'll be your defender on that. So I mean, and that the end times was the final thing that you I think the last thing you did, and you didn't even manage to finish the whole thing yourself, is that right? Before you left Games Workshop?
The book itself was finished before I left.
What was it like being asked to write the end of a world that you had loved since you were, a child?
I think the only was, am I really being asked this? This is very strange, isn't it? And again, it's the...
And I'm sorry, before you get on, I'm assuming that it wasn't you who went, can we just destroy the end world, please?
No, that's definitely not me. There is a responsibility there, because this is a thing that people love. This has been, even at the time, I mean, when End Times is like comes out in about 2011, I think, the first book, and then it goes up to late 2012, early 2013, I think, depending on what the release schedule was. Yeah. This is the thing that people love. It's been around for 30 years at this point, and if you're going to do something like that, it becomes hugely important to actually try and make it matter, and not just go and then the next day everyone woke up and the world was gone, which is not what I'm saying was ever a possibility with it, but it can be done that way. DC do that all the time. Here's your 6-issue miniseries and everything is different but strangely the same. Whereas with everything that exists within the End Times, you go, how many armies, how many characters, how many bits of the world are people attached to if you're going to end that world, and it's never coming back again. I mean, obviously, like all the best comic book deaths, it hasn't really lasted, because obviously the old world has come back, obviously not within the same, it's not continuing the timeline, they've taken a step back in time, and a few things have carried over into Age of Sigmar, so not everything is gone, but at the time you have to treat it as everything is gone. How do you try and give a swan song to an entire setting and all the characters that people love? And I think that the trick is to try and do the best service you can to as much as you can, so that at least, even if everyone has not necessarily been pivotal in the story, because it's really hard for that to happen on the scale that we're talking about, the scale of the setting and the time scale, the physical restraints of the product, that even if it's not necessarily the ending you want for some of those characters, they are at least there and they are doing things. And obviously some characters make out far better than others across it. Some characters get big sweeping stories with narrative arcs, or they have their superhero origin story and they just get stronger and stronger and stronger as the way they go through it. And some people are there for a battle and then get stepped on by a giant or something like that. And that's never not a difficult series of conversations to have, even in the space you're in. Can we do this to this character? Is this a bad thing? So, well, the alternative is them not being there at all, and that the last thing you will have heard about them was a timeline entry in a book 6 years ago. Oh, okay, so that's how can we try and give them a little bit of a moment before a terrible thing happens to them.
And obviously this big sweeping narrative of the End Times, it's very different, because it's a sort of it's a defined narrative, isn't it? It's this is the start of the End Times and the End Times, whereas in the previous things you sort of a little bit of a fluff, a little bit of a story that may be a very self-contained story in an army book or a codex or in the Middle Earth supplement. So was that the start of you going, I want to do what I'm assuming you wanted to do for years, and be an author and write your own worlds?
It's a little bit more complicated. I mean, the actual format and sort of the construction of moving to a much more prose style, because it's not quite prose even now, because you still have a lot of Word of God in those, then little breakouts for much longer stories perhaps than since the days of Bill King doing the stories in things like the Old Eldar and Elf books. But most of it is still, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. It's much still that big picture thing. But the actual change in the format was a thing that was essentially designed by, I guess you'd call it the management team, I think, more than anything else, which we were then working within. But in terms of the actual sort of storytelling through lines with it, I had been poking at some of it for a little while, because my Warhammer projects prior to that point, and I think in that order, was the new iteration of the Demons book, then followed by the 3 Elf books. And with the 3 Elf books particularly, because I'd always wanted to go back and do the Wood Elf book again, because as soon as the first one was finished, the one that Ant Reynolds and I did, the 3 Elf books, particularly, because as soon as the first one was finished, the one that Ant Reynolds and I did, the 3 Elf books, particularly, because as soon as the first one was finished, the one that Ant Reynolds and I did, the 3 Elf books, particularly, because as soon as the first one was finished, the one that Ant Reynolds and I did, the 3 Elf books, particularly, because as soon as the first one was finished, the one that Ant Reynolds and I did, the 3 Elf books, particularly, because as soon as the first one was finished, the one that Ant Reynolds and I did, the 3 Elf books, particularly, because as soon as the first one was finished, the one that Ant Reynolds and I did, the 3 Elf books, particularly, because as soon as the first one was finished, the one that Ant Reynolds and I did, the 3 Elf books, particularly, because as soon as the first one was finished, the one that you kind of look at it and go, no, I understand how we would do it better. That's the curse of any kind of creative profession, as you probably know yourself. You go, I can't go back and redo that now, and it's literally as soon as you see it, you see all the ways it should have been.
I'll be editing this and listen to you going, and I'll think, yes, I should have done exactly this cutaway or this whatever.
Yeah, because that's just how it works, isn't it? So part of that is that somewhere along the line, I ended up inheriting the writing duties on the other 2 elf books as well, with the goal that we could try and make them a single story, which is why you have much more crossover between the various elf factions in each of their books, so they all have a story where they kind of cross over, and some of the big names are present in ways that they weren't before. And that was all steadily building to, no, maybe there's some more stuff we can do after that point. And then the End Times came along, and that became the place that we did some of that, although not necessarily not remotely in the way that it would have happened, but there was almost that sense of forward motion. How much it comes across if you're on the other side reading them, I don't know. I'd have worn like 3 different hats. I would have done some project management stuff for the projects I was working on. I would have written rules, and I would have written background, 240k game editions back to back, as that I wrote the background section in one and then the rules in the other, because that's how the job worked. But then it became a very hard split between the rules and the law stuff. So I decided to move into writing law instead, because that was the thing I wanted to pursue.
When you left, I know you've still got some involvement in Warhammer products like Vermintide. You sort of involved, you mentioned that earlier on in the games, being a sort of director of them, which sounds really cool. But largely you're an author now. You're a fantasy sci-fi author, and you can see on the shelf behind you one of your first your debut, I think it's.
Yeah, that one. Yeah.
When you first stepped away from Games Workshop, were you going, right, I'm going to write a book, or had you written a book, or had you planned the books already, or was it literally, right, here's my first day in the new world, and here's the first word I'm writing in Legacy of Ash?
No, I mean, I've written bits and pieces for a long time. I mean, me trying to write books goes back, again, like 25, 30 years. And fortunately, all of those files are long since lost to time, because they would have been dreadful. Because that's how it works, right? You do very, very badly, and then steadily it becomes acceptable. All the world changes around you, and the thing that you did was really bad is now considered to be really good. That's always nice, but you can't count on it. So it was a thing that I dropped into very quickly at that point. So I don't know. There are a bunch of things that are sitting unpublished. There's a self-published book out there. There's a couple of things that I did for Osprey to tie into the Frostgrave setting. But yes, in terms of, this is the one that's always counted as the debut, because it is.
It says on the front, a hugely entertaining debut.
Yeah. I mean, they like to say that. It's so you do know I've published books before. Oh yes, but it's an Orbit debut, you see, so that's fine. That's how it works. I mean, that one is a world, again, that goes back like 25 years at this point, maybe a little bit longer, and then was just built on and built on and built on.
Was it,
and became its own
one of
thing.
those things where you had this idea for a world or a story or a character or whatever years and years ago, and slowly it's just been bubbling away in your mind, and eventually it's become big enough, or you've got an idea enough that you can write it?
It was something that I kind of had a few bits and pieces in my brain about how the story could work and who some of the lead characters were, for probably about 5 years before I actually sat down and started writing it. The actual setting goes back again, as I say, much further. And then, because it's really good fun trying to break into publishing, well, certainly getting yourself as a traditionally published author, it's the kind of fun that is parallels like crawling over broken glass and barbed wire and things like that, because it not only can be quite uncomfortable at times, it takes a very long time. So I'd written quite a lot of things, and then I'd kind of got to the point of, well, we've done all these things. These haven't gone somewhere. I have got an agent now, but we've not been able to get anything placed with the publisher. And it's just like, well, I may as well do this one now that I feel like I'm not ready to write, because why not at this stage? So I started writing this one, and then this, of course, is, as you say, it's the debut. It is the thing that really took off, not just with the publishers, but it seems to have been incredibly well received in the world. Everything you write has the potential to be the last thing that you write. So the worst thing you can do is go, well, I never wrote that one because I was too scared of how it would work. And I am one of the very lucky few people, because not everyone gets to be in the situation to do all the things that I've done. Whether it's, as I say, whether it's working with Games Workshop, whether it is working for Games Workshop, whether it is the novels, whether it is doing the voice direction, whether it is actually we're just working on video games generally. The idea, back many years ago, I'm playing like games on the ZX Spectrum with its 8 colours that just bleed into each other as soon as the sprites cross each other. And you go, no, one day you'll actually, real actors will be reading lines that you have written in a game, and actually you'll have cast some of those actors and you'll have directed them. It's easy to get lost in the moment and go, well, I wish this had been different, or I wish this isn't right. Oh, why didn't I see it at the time? I could have done that a bit better. But the truth is that no, I'm hugely fortunate to be where I am. I need to get better at remembering that sometimes, I have to admit, because you just, when you hit things, you just go, no, I can see this thing in front of me and that's all I can see. But, there is a whole forest of trees out there. You don't need to focus on the one that doesn't seem like it's in the right place, because generally speaking, it will turn out that there is a thing that you're going to learn from that and you'll move forward with. So,
when was the last time you picked up any of your games, the supplements that you wrote, and actually used them in a tabletop game?
Probably not for 10 years
Really?
At this point. Yeah.
I find this fascinating, because this is what all of the games designers and writers that I've spoken to have said exactly the same thing. Is it just too hard to work on what you're currently working on if you're always thinking about the old one or playing your old games?
I think it's complicated, because I think it's different for different reasons at different times. I mean, part of it for me is that I've become very, very aware of one of the things that I took away from my time with Games Workshop is it's really not a good thing for me personally, for my job and my hobby to be the same thing, because you hit a point sooner or later, and then it ebbs and flows. It's not a continual state of being, but where you suddenly go, I feel like I've just spent the last 3 weeks working, because the thing that you do when you're not working actually still kind of is work. I mean, obviously it's all transferable skills anyway, so that's always going to be true if you're doing any kind of skill-based hobby, and most hobbies are skill-based, let's be honest, unless it's watching TV.
Now you're not at Games Workshop when you're not writing rule books, can you still not say?
But this is why it's complicated. So you have to build on top of that. Firstly, that I'm okay at painting miniatures, but I hate doing it. I think most people have that point where they go halfway through a miniature and they go, oh my god, I've ruined it. This looked better before. I should have left it either as bare metal with a spray paint on, because dear god, what have I done to it? And then you get to the end of it and you go, oh, that's okay. But just living through that process, I absolutely hate it. I've never enjoyed it. I was always games first, and actually not even necessarily, if I'm going to be honest about it, even the playing of the game, sort of like the theory and this is the thing, that this is how it goes together, this is the thing that makes it work. That's the joy of it. It's the mechanism almost, which is a horrible thing to say out loud, but it's true, and I think it's true for more people than will admit it.
I'm sure a lot of people have a notebook or a file on the computer or whatever it is with army lists that they've written that they've never even assembled. No, that's part of the fun of it, isn't it?
Absolutely. So it is that. That's part of it, and I think the other thing as well is that because you live through those changes of editions, anyone that you speak to, because you'll have had this conversation with people, I'm sure, they will have their version of the game system, which is their version of the game system, which is the one that they love and the one that, given the choice, they will go back and play. Obviously, the old world has come back partly as a result of that. But for some people, they will always be 6th edition or 8th edition or 5th edition players, or well, it always went to mistake once it went into colour, so stop writing it on papyrus. The nostalgia for it is much more of a visual and tactile thing rather than the activity itself. And for 40k, of course, it's even worse because I go all the way back to Rogue Trader for 40k, and I was there all the way through 6th edition. You go, that's at least 4 very different states of game at that point. So which is the one? And you think, well, it's probably the one that I had all of my beautiful Jez Goodwin Eldar Aspect Warriors for, because that was the version, which is 2nd edition, which is the one that I love. But you just go, I don't think I would go back and play that for fun, because it was very different, definitely an experience unto itself, and I have hugely fond memories of it, but it's not something you would think time. And again, just on top of that, wargaming is a very time-intensive hobby.
Do you even look at the articles on the Warhammer community website, or pick up White Dwarf, or follow?
I will see things as they go past. Obviously, there are things that I will engage with bits and pieces because they are relevant to what I'm doing professionally. And I'm aware of things because obviously I still have a lot of friends and ex-colleagues that I am in contact with that do all of these bits and pieces, and are aware of it. Some of the actors I work with desperately love the setting and talk about it all the time, so I hear things from them, but I am not particularly current, particularly with rules mechanics and bits and pieces like that, because of course that bit is very definitely behind me, because it's not what I do anymore. And again, it's what I was saying earlier about some things are with you for a period of time, then you move forward and then you do something else. But it's just how it goes, really.
The reason I wanted to ask is because you mentioned a couple of times that Arnor and Angmar were your kind of babies almost, because like your favourite supplement, I gather, is the Ruin of Arnor that you wrote for Lord of the Rings. They've just started releasing some new miniatures for
splendid.
Arnor.
I had no idea that
that's
existed.
Really cool, isn't it?
Yeah. But you know what, it's actually really nice, because it is that thing of going, actually no, the work that we did on that book back in the day is actually strong enough that it's worth coming back to, and that's wonderful. Actually, that's a really nice thing, and the fact that it's building on the designs of the miniatures that the Perrys did at the time for it, and that's absolutely splendid. Maybe we'll have more than 2 Barrow-wights now. You never know.
I hope you found that really interesting, hearing from Matt Ward about his time at Games Workshop and beyond. If you want to hear more from other people like him, Rick Priestley, Alessio Cavatori, the Perry twins who've worked at Games Workshop and moved on to do things in their own right, then please do consider having a look at my channel for a few more interviews. They'll be linked in the description below. And of course, you can subscribe, like this one, and if I'm really cheeky, maybe you can become a patron and support what I do here on YouTube. Thanks very much for watching. There'll be more interviews, maybe, at some time in the future. But in the meantime, thanks for watching. Boo-ra-rum.